everybody. How was your morning session? Hello, everybody online. I'm Mike Midlow, Program Director at Fishcraft, and this is the first of our afternoon events and discussions, talks, etc. As we talked about last night, and you heard that the theme this year is generations. And as we're pulling together, it takes all year long to pull together our summer Fishcraft teachers, our instructors, these great authors. And at one point I kind of realized, it's like, whoa, that's a lot of poet laureates in this group. Not only that, but I thought it might be interesting and a great opportunity to kind of learn about poet laureate programs, what it means to be one, how it happens, what are the responsibilities and projects. I'm super curious about this. And as far as generations go, we have Rena here, who is poet laureate of Washington State. I'm curious to see how it all happened and how you approach it. And then Mojgani is the current Oregon poet laureate, and then Kim Stafford, who's kind of pulls all these different generations together, who was the poet laureate of Oregon, and also his father was the poet laureate of Oregon. So we'll see what kind of perspective we have. And then I thought, well, I'm not going to be the person to do this. And so I asked Robert Stubblefield if he would moderate on that mic. Yes. Gracefully said, yeah, I'll do that. So I just want to turn it over to Robert, and y'all have fun. Thanks for showing up.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to all of you for showing up this afternoon, and especially thanks to Rena, Anise, and Kim for joining me up here on the stage today. And mostly is how I see this is a discussion between the poet laureates, and without me trying to get in the way too much. And they're also going to share some of their work with you today, so you'll see why they were and are poet laureates. But one thing that I thought would be kind of interesting to kick off today's panel is I ask everyone to bring a poem and share that resonated with them early in their reading or writing lives and continues to do so today. And one of the ideas was maybe it would be a poem or a work that superficially didn't seem to have a lot to do with our experience, but spoke to us in a little bit more universal way. And so I'll kick that off with the poem that I'm going to read, and then I think I'll have each of you share yours, and then we'll kind of start the discussion as to why that meant something to us and continues to mean something. So the work that I chose is Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices?
It's a good one. Love that poem. All right, so this is The Lanyard by Billy Collins. The other day, I was ricocheting slowly off the blue walls of this room, moving as if underwater from typewriter to piano, from bookshelf to an envelope lying on the floor, when I found myself in the L section of the dictionary, where my eyes fell upon the word lanyard. No cookie nibbled by a French novelist could send one into the past more suddenly, a past where I sat at a workbench at a camp by a deep Adirondack lake, learning how to braid long, thin plastic strips into a lanyard, a gift for my mother. I had never seen anyone use a lanyard or wear one if that's what you did with them. But that did not keep me from crossing strand over strand again and again until I had made a boxy red and white lanyard for my mother. She gave me life and milk from her breasts, and I gave her a lanyard. She nursed me in my sick room, lifted spoons of medicine to my lips, laid cold face cloths on my forehead, and then led me out into the airy light, and taught me to walk and swim, and I, in turn, presented her with a lanyard. Here are 1,000 meals, she said, and here is clothing and a good education, and here is your lanyard, I replied. Which I made with a little help from the counselor. Here is a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs, bones, and teeth, and 2 clear eyes to read the world, she whispered. And here, I said, is the lanyard I made at camp. And here I wish to say to her now is a smaller gift, not the worn truth that you can never repay your mother, but the rueful admission that when she took the 2-tone lanyard from my hand, I was sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even. Wish I wrote that.
This is Disasterology by the poet Jeffrey McDaniel. The badger is the 13th astrological sign, my sign, the one the other signs evicted, unanimously. So what? Think I want to read about my future in the newspaper next to the comics? My 3rd grade teacher told me I had no future. I run through snow and turn around just to make sure I've got a past. My life's a chandelier dropped from an airplane. I graduated first in my class from alibi school. There ought to be a healthy family cage at the zoo, or an open field where I can lose my mother as many times as I need. When I get bored, I call the cops, tell them there's a pervert peeking in my window. Then I slip on a flimsy nightgown, go outside, press my face against the glass, and wait. This makes me proud to be an American, where drunk drivers ought to wear necklaces made from the spines of children they've run over. I remember my face being invented through a windshield, all the wounds stitched with horsehair so the scars galloped across my forehead. I remember the hymns cherubs sang in my bloodstream, the way even my shadow ached when the chubby infant stopped. I remember wishing I could be boiled like water and made pure again. Desire so real it could be outlined in chalk. My eyes were the color of palm trees in a hurricane. I'd wake up and my id would start the day without me. Somewhere, a junkie fixes the hole in his arm and a racing car zips around my halo. A good God is hard to find. Each morning, I look in the mirror and say, promise me something. Don't do the things I've done.
Well, I told Robert I have a little different take on this. I went back to, I think the first rhythmic, poetic urge I heard was na 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 na, you know, and rhythm has a power. And then shortly after that, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. You would chant it even though you knew it wasn't true. But chanting it helped a little bit. But then I have to go to, I came home crying from school one time. The kids had, I had a lot of hair then, curly hair, and they teased me about my curly hair, you know. And Kiyam, that's a girl's name, you know, and so on. And my mother said, well, when we consider providence, we must admit it's fair that some are given brilliant minds and some have curly hair. So that's where I started.
I think that's a great starting point, Kim. And so there's a variety in the works that we chose today, and I think that those first poems that call to us, that make us perhaps want to do that, to make that attempt. And for me, those winter Sundays, even though Robert Hayden, growing up in Detroit and writing about a totally different situation, it made me realize that somebody went to great effort on my behalf out of love, and that love wasn't a given. It was a choice that they made almost every day, and I had taken that for granted in a way which I probably would continue to do, but not in the same way. And it made me want to express that gratitude, and also just the language in it. Some of the like the blue black cold. That's something that struck me so immediately and accurately that it seems cliche, but it's original. And also it confused me and intrigued me in a good way. Like, love's austere and lonely offices. It's a strange phrase. It makes you think about love in a different way, and it also acknowledges a difficulty of that relationship and that household. But even later, decades after the fact, that recognition. So that's kind of why I chose that.
It's so interesting that the poems you read are basically the same urge.
Yes.
Like, I didn't understand the gifts I was receiving.
Yeah, and it expressed in totally different tones, but just because Rena and I talked about that a little bit about that yesterday, because you mentioned those winter Sundays too.
Yeah, I've always loved that poem, and when I found out that he was reading that, and then also the prompt was to think back on something that we responded to early on in our career. And I remember in undergrad, like right after I had declared English as my major, because I had been a theater major previously, and I switched. And right after that, one of the assignments was to go see a poetry reading. And Billy Collins was reading at the Skagit Valley Poetry Festival in LaConner. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll go see this guy with you. Like, my classmate invited me, and I was like, sure, why not? And so we went, and he drove down there and everything. And then, we walk into this auditorium, and it's like a packed gymnasium full of people. And there's this guy reading this freaking hilarious poetry. Like, all of it was so amazing. It just kind of blew my mind because, up until that point, poetry was like, which I also love, but it was always like, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways.
And it was
I
written
love
by
thee
dead
to
people.
The depth and breadth of a height, and or Shel Silverstein. So this was like a revelation to me, and I was super psyched about it. I was like, wow, he's just doing it. Like, he's thanking his mom. This is the Mother's Day card that I would like to have, that if I shared with my own mother, she'd be like, what? So it was really exciting to me that could be poetry. And I think that initial encounter with it was like, all right, okay, so we're in this, we're doing it. I'm going with this English stuff. So, yeah.
With mine, it was not the exact same thing as what Rena was saying, but kind of similarly. So I had it was my freshman year of college, and I had just started writing poetry basically the year before at the end of high school, and had also in the summer between graduating high school and starting college, I had come across an article that talked about this poetry contest of performance called the Poetry Slam, and I was so intrigued and fascinated by the idea of it, something that felt very socialist in its way of offering poetry to people, which I was 100% behind, but it also had poems from poets that, you know, like Kim had just mentioned, like, they were all alive, you know, like, and they were all like regular people. Like, they weren't alive poets that were in a journal that we would sometimes read in my creative writing class in high school. They were just people from all walks of life who also wrote poems. And their poems reflected, if not necessarily like what their experiences were, but they were reflective of the urgency of being a living, breathing, flesh and bone, blood person. And so it was something that kind of like clicked of like, oh, you know, like I want to see what it's like to read poems aloud to people. And my freshman year of college, this poet came through town, Jeffrey McDaniel, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a poet in person read something. And Jeff would perch on the edge of the stage. Like, that poem, I remember it was just like seared into my head, like he was just screamed at the audience in this monotone of, "The badger is the 13th astrological sign. My sign. The sign the other signs evicted." And I was just like, what is this? You know, it was so weird, and it was funny and heartbreaking. And I remember me and my friend Eric, like, bought his book together. It was like, I got $7.50, I got $7.50. And eventually I was gifted his half of the book. But that book, Alibi School, like, it was my Bible for years. And, you know, like, in that poem, throughout across his whole book, there's just these poems that made me, not only did he affect me in person as in regards to like, oh, seeing what a person is doing on stage with these words and their body and their voice, this is definitely something I want to explore. But then reading the words over and over again on the page, I was just floored by what he would do with language and imagery, and how clever and creative and imaginative, you know, like things that were both so far-reaching and also so simple, you know, like lines like, "Your eyes are so green, one of your parents must be part traffic light," or "Your eyes are so blue, they leak," you know, like things of that nature that were just so apparent and so poetic at the same time. So Jeff always was in those early years a very, very foundational person for not just like the work itself, but rather the relationship to the work and wanting to explore it.
Well, it was a little mysterious for me because, of course, my dad was a poet, and you know, there were always his books were lying around, magazines, Crazy Horse, you know, all these exotic magazines. But we never saw him write. I mean, he wasn't a writer visibly because he got up so early. And by the time we got up at 6:30 or 7, he was just in a great mood, you know, because he'd done his work for that day, and then he'd, you know, go off and do other things. But there were just ideas floating around. You know, he had this, I didn't realize until years later it was a trick. We'd just be sort of babbling at the dinner table, and at some point he'd say, you know, Milton had the same idea. And then he'd start talking about, oh, yeah, well, Milton and I, you know, we're kind of in cahoots. Or he would just pose a challenging question. One of his lines was, well, let's talk recklessly about that. You know, and then he would dive in. I remember one evening, he just out of nowhere, he said, you know, Erik Erikson said, if at the end of your life you look back and you say, no, I wasn't supposed to be like that. If only they would have let me, if only I would have. And if that's your attitude, you are doomed. On the other hand, if you look back at the end of your life and you say, that was my life, that was my story, that's what I did, that's what I didn't do, then you can help others. You know, and I looked over at my mom. He was talking to my mom. You know, I mean, they had had some kind of altercation, and he was smuggling this literary thing in here to get back at her. You know, so poetry and ideas and readings and books were kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
Well, I guess you talked about, those influences around the dinner table, those first readings that you went to that that really made an impact on you. And I guess to come back to some of you being the poet laureate, I just wonder if you could express what that meant to you personally, as much or more than professionally, but perhaps both, and the validation that it brought you, and also maybe the challenge that it presented to you. And we can go in any order you want. And then,
Yeah.
and then I hope we'll come back to this one. Sure.
Well, for me, I was nominated 3 times, and the third time I was selected. And I went to a reading by my predecessor, Elizabeth Woody, Navajo Wasco writer from Warm Springs. And I've told some of you this story. She said just this one little thing that really clarified my role for me as poet laureate. She said, the more I do poetry, the less it's about what the poem is and more about who the poem's for. And that just became my whole thing as poet laureate. I'm going to write a poem for Klamath Falls. I'm going to write a poem for the Oregon legislature. I'm going to write a poem for the governor. I'm going to write a poem for the inmates at Two Rivers Prison. I'm going to write a poem for veterans. So it really called, I think something that I had done occasionally became, I kind of hit my groove. That's what I'm here to do. I'm writing poems for people. So that was a big thing.
Like the professional aspect of the question, there's definitely like an element where, we this kind of bubbled up in our conversation, since, your term is now ended, but you're always the Washington Poet Laureate, you're always the Poet Laureate of Oregon,
Come to you.
Exactly, and so there's something really cool and fun and getting to be able to continue having that mantle, speak for oneself. So there is definitely a joy and an appreciation of that. Challenges that came with it for me were that before my term started, I was in a fortunate place of that I was a poet for my living, and also as a poet for my living, it meant that I was in a place where I got to just make work, and I had people who welcomed receiving that work, and so I just simply got to make work for myself and explore my audience in that from that vantage point. And not so much that really changed when beginning my appointment, but the kind of doorways or windows or access points to me and my work became different. And so that also then meant that what people wanted of me or expected of me or requested of me, much of that was new feeling. And so it wasn't so much that there was requests or wants that didn't vibe with me, but I definitely had a projection of those that I placed on my own shoulders. I don't really want to do this, but am I supposed to? Or what is this person really asking of me? What are they really expecting of me? Even though they might just be hey, could you come and do this? So that has been an ongoing process of a challenge over these years. But on a personal level, I think the largest thing for me has been simply that Oregon was not in my life plan if I had a life plan. When I came to Oregon in 2004, even that wasn't a move to here. It was I needed a break from New York City where I was living, and I thought I'd be in Portland, Oregon for 3 months. And so to have those 3 months turn into an almost 20-year relationship with a part of this country that I really loved, and to have one, the welcoming, the validation, the invitation of this place being home by being appointed in this, but also two, being given to myself, like the responsibility of establishing that connection in a different way to this place has just been really, really lovely, and really gratifying. So.
Well, for me personally, I'm like, I feel like being in this role, I grew a lot as a person. I'm really shy, and I have a really hard time talking in front of people. But, I've had to do it pretty much constantly for the last 2 years, and so that stretched me, and now I'm just like, hey, whatever, I'm okay up here now, and it doesn't freak me out as much. And it's also meant a lot for me to be able to just have poet as like the thing that I do for a living. Someone shared a story in my workshop today about Lucille Clifton, and I can't remember the other poet across the hall, when they asked him what he wanted on his door, he said poet, and then when she came on board, she had on her door put other poet. And I really appreciated that because, like under my LinkedIn profile, I just had poet, and that was really nice. And then professionally also, prior to being the Poet Laureate, I was a career counselor. And one of the things that I would counsel people to do, was like to work towards the thing that they love doing. And I just counseled myself into the Poet Laureate position, basically. So I was a really good career counselor. I may go back to that someday. But, it was just kind of huge to be able to do the thing that I love professionally for 2 years, and just to kind of go around spreading poetry and sharing poetry and having poetry shared with me. I can't think of a more meaningful position. And the fact that it was 2 years of active service was also kind of perfect, because at the end of that, you're tired and you want to reflect and you want to kind of look back at the work that you produced and the things that you did. And I responded to a lot of commissions and a lot of, people reaching out and asking if I would write poems for this or that. So I have a whole collection of work that is a little bit like Frankenstein's monster. It works, it hangs together, but it's just kind of like different pieces from all these different people that commissioned poems, right? So it's kind of interesting to look back and see where each one had its origins. Very meaningful, very special.
Yeah, and you've addressed this a little bit in the discussion to this point, but I guess I'd ask each of you, what do you see as the primary and secondary roles of a poet laureate of a state or of the nation? Because I think we have these kind of abstract ideas that to get poetry out. But Kim, specifically, you mentioned a poem for the people of Klamath Falls, a poem for the inmates at the Two Rivers Correctional. How much is poetic in evangelism? How do you go about spreading the word, or what are some of the communities that you see as underserved that you want to reach out to or have reached out to?
Well, I gradually decided that I was bringing poetry to people who don't read poetry, especially in places outside what Rich Wanschneider called the I-5 writers community. I loved going to, I remember driving all the way out to Umatilla Reservation, and there were 7 people there, but they were really cool people. One of them was Chuck Sams, who's now the head of the National Park Service. So my motto was, it doesn't matter how many come, it's who comes. And sometimes there were very few, but I remember one time in John Day when they made the football team come to the poetry reading, and I was told that they had to stay for one poem. And I decided they are not going to leave after this. So I laid some good stuff on them, and they made it to 3 poems, And I thought, what a breakthrough.
Kim, if if you can hook those Grant Union prospectors on 3 poems, that's a huge accomplishment.
Actually, I have to put in one high point here. We went to the basketball game at Paisley, and toward the end of the first half, the announcer said, "Now, folks, we got something a little unusual. We got a poet in the crowd here, and we're going to have him come out to the half line here and give us a poem during halftime." You know, so I did a poem. I thought, this is it. Peak of my career.
Am I correct that it's the Paisley Mosquitoes, or am I just saying that because
That's in derision. I think they're
the Mosquito Festival is in Paisley.
Yeah, no, they're not the Mosquitoes.
Okay.
They were playing the Prospectors, though. Where were those from?
They're from Grant Union.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
We won.
I don't know, like the like sound bite that, you know, because I think like when one is laureate, folks are like, cool, and they're like, so what is that? You know, like it's folks get really excited, and then they get really curious. It's like, I don't know what that is, and you know, so it's like over these years, the sound bite for me is like, you know, being a steward to and for poetry, to and for the people of Oregon. But I think like with me personally, like just like on, you know, what I've wanted to do is, you know, and I talked a little bit about this with in my workshop yesterday, that, you know, I'm really fascinated by the ways in which that we are surrounded by poems, like just continually, and you know, sometimes we see them, and more often we don't, and like that the role of the poem isn't even necessarily to actually become a poem. I don't think, you know, that in regards to like being a collection of words and sentences and images onto a piece of paper, the poem isn't beholden to that. Whether we put it on a piece of paper does not mean that the poem that is there in the world does not have existence. And so, you know, what are the ways that I myself am, you know, heightening my observation and recognizing of poems that are existing in my life around me? And what perhaps in the undertaking as laureate, you know, am I seeking and aiding others in doing that as well? You know, wherever they might be on that path, whether it's something that they do very regularly, like how can we make it happen even more, you know, whether it happens almost never, how can we have that start happening, you know? So that's, for me, that has felt like my role in all this.
So one of the things that I said that I wanted to do during my term as Poet Laureate in Washington State was to celebrate the beauty of the natural world through poetry. And the aim there is, my thinking is that because, you know, it's so hard to talk to people about climate change and climate crisis who are resistant to climate change and climate crisis, poetry can open that door a little bit to loving the natural world and celebrating it and celebrating the beauty. And what's at stake without being like threatening or asking anybody to come over and agree with you or anything. You know, it's just kind of like a nice, open, airy space to talk about hard things, any kind of hard thing, but especially some of the harder things that we're facing as a society around climate. And so I was really excited to be so well received in like by organizations and in communities who are working on that. Like I got to present to salmon scientists and lawyers and, you know, like these organizations that were planting trees, you know, like the Street Tree Society and all of these different places that wanted me to come and share that message. It was really beautiful, and who wanted to participate in that message. So I felt like that was a big success, stating that goal. But I ended up, so the pinnacle of that really was sharing a poem with the legislature at the opening session, the opening joint legislative session in January. And Inslee his staff invited me to come and to write a poem. They said it should be about 7 minutes long, and I was like, oh my God, 7 minutes! That's the longest poem in all the world. But I did it. I made it it's like 6 minutes and 45 seconds, and they accept it. But anyways, to be able to go there and read that poem to those lawmakers was like a very powerful thing for me, but even more so because at that event, tribal leadership was all up in the balcony. And I met with our chairman before the event. You know, we kind of had a little chat, and he was like, "Oh, good to see you." But to be able to see them up there and to be able to speak to, the theme was a vision for equality in 2023. And as I was writing that poem, what does equality look like? It kind of looks like how I have been taught in oral history, in the oral tradition, how we governed and what it looked like in our tribal communities prior to colonization. And so I brought those themes into the poem, and to be able to read that and speak to the idea of, the promise that was made, that for as long as the rivers run and as long as the sun rises and sets, you shall have timber and fish and game for your frying pans. That promise that was made over and over and over again when Governor Stevens, who was the first territorial governor, was negotiating treaties with the tribes. In not keeping that, not only have tribes been disenfranchised, but all of us have been endangered by the impacts of, over-harvesting timber and salmon and damming streams and things like that. And so I feel like to use the position to speak to these things was really powerful for me and hopefully beneficial to the citizens of Washington State.
Thanks. And this, what you were just talking about, kind of brings me to my next question. And I want to give you each a chance to share some of your work, but I also want to get this question to make sure we don't run out of time. And Anise, when you're talking about people saying, what is that? I just wonder, as the poet laureate now, do you find yourself kind of making up the job as you go along in a good way, in a
100%.
Dynamic way?
I one of the things that I'm really grateful for with how the Oregon appointment is run, that it basically here's your responsibilities, here's the mission of the thing, and here's you. Do whatever it is you intend to do during your time here, whatever that looks like. And so, I think that's that's a really beautiful thing on an individual level, that I get to be excited about the things that I'm doing because they're things that I'm excited about. But it also is a beautiful thing, I think, for the structure and the characteristics and sustainability of an institution like this, in that it allows a multitude of voices to be present in this work that's happening. So what's something that you're proud of as poet laureate that you're accomplishing now? And for Kim and Rena, what was something that you were happy with or proud of during your tenures? And we talked about that a little bit.
Yeah. So event-based, I think you asked if we'd bring a poem to share that was associated with that. I was going to bring the long 6-minute poem, 6 minute and 45 second poem. But I thought, well, it's on the internet, and but this one also I think is on the internet, but here we go. This was a very special event that happened kind of repeatedly, but then it culminated in an opportunity to read at the Pegasus Awards in Chicago at the Poetry Foundation. Last year, they gave $1.1 million to poets, and it was because it was their 10-year anniversary or 11-year anniversary, and so they went big, but they invited me to read as a land acknowledgement this poem, which is called Welcome to Indian Country. Where is Indian country? It's everywhere we stand, it's anywhere we dance, it's where the earth loves the feel of our feet. Welcome to Indian country. What does that mean? It means this is where we lift our voice in song and make a joyful drumbeat for our hearts to sing along. Welcome to Indian country, this beloved country here, where we honor our ancestors by growing stronger every year, by making laughter the answer that wipes away our tears. Welcome to Indian country. What does the future hold? In uncertain times like these, we reach for words like hope and things we can be sure of: sunrises, beauty, love. Welcome to Indian country. It's everywhere we dance and where the feast is truly grand. Welcome to Indian country. Now give us back our land. See, so you laugh. I tell the students that if you just kind of like give them like all these nice little soft, like, sweet little images, and then you just like, just like give it to them, then you're going to have a better response, right? And humor is truth that is delivered just kind of unapologetically and more suddenly than we're used to. So it's not really funny. I know you don't all think that it's funny that I'm asking you to give us back our land, because I mean it. But it's a little bit more, you can take it in a little easier, right? So humor is the golden rule. But the poem was written for an activity that I did that came about by being Poet Laureate, but didn't happen in Washington State. I got to travel with an ensemble of all indigenous musicians to land-grant colleges, and we did a show where the musicians contributed a piece and I contributed, some stories and some poems, and it was a show that we did called Welcome to Indian Country. And to be working with these creatives, these like super talented individuals, all from tribal communities across the country, Maine, Arizona, just like everywhere. They came from everywhere, and we were together in this beautiful thing that we were doing. It was so cool. So that was a very special thing that I'm proud of.
So the poem that I was going to share, as soon as I grab it, isn't so much, I would say, where is it? Isn't so much connected to events that I did while in the laureate position, but it's something that I wrote while in it. And on one level sort of speaks to some of the aspect. I'll just read it right quick. Early on, so I'm currently in second term as laureate, and early on in first year of first term, the New York Times was reaching out to laureates across the country to invite them to write or send in a poem in November that was centered around gratitude. So this was when Portland was very, around the country. We had just spent a summer of protests in the name of George Floyd, and Portland had by no means quieted down on any of that. Was probably about, 5 months into a year-long nightly vocalization against these things. And so there's an aspect of that reality of living in a place of what are the ways that we show up for each other. So that's what this was speaking to. Thankful for the bend without the break. Thankful for the branch beneath the weight of the finch, light-boned they be. The shake of a fur for the bird to alight the cloud. Thankful for the earth, still having not released us from the embrace of its sky, its rivers that peak, those stars on clear nights swimming through both. For the crows consistent in their caw, as if saying, wake, the morning lies in the street. Wanting of me to be bronzed with its kiss, thankful that every day in my city the people strengthen together because they see one another, gather for something unseen and powerful. thankful for prayers made into action for strangers, fists raising in the name of another, hands giving to the other, thankful for somewhere in the distance, the ocean calling like an answer to the question our bodies raise, lifting towards a grace that only takes shape when it is spoken aloud for someone else, white-capped, green deep, and full of song, coming from the place where it had been thrown, back to from where it had been tossed, coming in these waves against these tired ankles of ours, like the waters were giving us a softest carpet under our soles, a floor being built to build the home. The things that, was interesting being Laureate in a time of COVID where, I remember being very, very excited and the possibility of this thing means that I get to potentially travel around this state that has been home for many years and see it in a way that I never have. And then March 2020 happened, and I got appointed in May and didn't really go anywhere, And so a lot of that time at the beginning was, trying to figure out and explore what are ways in which to connect with communities under the umbrella of the life that we're, are inside of. So two of those things that surfaced over these years were just really exciting for me to do. And one was this telephone project where for the month of April, both this past year and last year, there was a number that folks could call. And the first year, each week was a poem each day from a different poet laureate. So last year, there were poems from Kim, there were poems from Liz Woody, there were poems from Pauline Peterson, and there were poems from myself. And so each day, just a new poem that folks could call. And then this past year, similarly so, except with having a different poet each day, largely from Oregon. I think maybe there was a couple from outside of Oregon, but in the Northwest. And then last year also, I had started doing this thing of, just very much missing the ways in which that we gather and not being able to. And so much of the pandemic for me was spent trying to figure out what are new ways to gather and perform. And so I started doing these readings out of the window of my art studio, where at sunset I would read poems, and people were invited to sit or stand in the streets. And it was something that I did every 2-3 weeks between spring and fall, and I've continued this year. And it's something that for me, as my artistic thing that calls to the world, it answers that. But it also has been something really, really beautiful to witness, hundreds of people coming to just listen to poems, blocking off the street so that cars can't drive down, that's been a really rad thing and to try to figure out what are the ways to explore what's at the heart of this, and whatever is at the heart of this, are there other ways in which that can be, moved into other arenas of gathering. So, yeah.
Well, I was going to read a poem I wrote for the Two Rivers Prison and read to the inmates there, but I realized I had on my computer a poem I wrote for Fish Trap in July of 2019. And so this is addressed to all of us writers. It's called Secrets and Vows. Long after being a beginner in teaching, I still grow anxious starting a class. I want everyone to fall into a kind of love with their own voices, their stories, their indelible, mysterious memories and arresting sorrows, to cherish every shock and sensation in the telling. I've come to love the way after a young text is read aloud, we all take a bright breath, as the story we heard and the story we have lived greet one another, exchange gifts and part with reluctance. I don't know how I would live without this intimacy writers share in the making time, telling secrets and making vows to truth.
Well, I think, any potential poet laureates in the audience today or watching us have seen some role modeling done. And so I guess a question that I had for you is, when you stepped into the role of poet laureate, or when you contemplated how you were going to carry out that mission, did you have any role models from previous poet laureates? And we'd spoken about that a little bit, on a national level or the state level. What traditions did you intend to continue that maybe you had been impressed by?
Well, I remember I was on the panel for the Idaho Writer in Residence. Before, Oregon had the Poet Laureate, and then there was a hiatus. My dad served for through three governors. He tried to retire with letters to 3 governors, and they all said no. But then when he died, there was a hiatus, and then so during that time, I was on the panel for the Idaho Writer in Residence, and I was just impressed by how that program was put together. The idea about you'll give a certain number of readings, you'll go to remote places, you'll try to serve the underserved, and it was just beautifully articulated. So then I ended up on the committee to recreate the Oregon Poet Laureate, and I brought that on. I actually proposed what I still think is a great idea. Instead of having a poet laureate, the Oregon traveling poets. And you'd have half a dozen, and some would be spoken word, some would be young, some would be rural, some would be urban, native, and there'd be a group just fanning out, and that's still my aspiration.
Even though it's weird since Kim is right here, but definitely Kim had very, very kind and reassuring words to offer up to me when I stepped into the role, which I was very, very appreciative of and grateful for.
I wrote a poem for Anise, passing the torch.
And it definitely was given to me. It's like I was like super pumped about this thing, and then it started, and it was like that thing that I'd mentioned earlier. I was like, oh, here's these. I don't know what I'm doing. Like, what I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Do I want to? It was just like all this thing, these kind of doubts spinning around. And so it was really lovely to get these words from Kim, and with those words also I think came this, relationship and connection to Oregon laureates of before, and just seeing the ways in which many of them were just different from each other. And getting to participate and be part of that lineage, so to speak. But also since then, from afar, the current San Francisco poet laureate Tongo Eisen Martin, I've just really loved seeing how the way he moves through different spaces and being very present. In his communities, in his role as an activist, not a poet laureate, but and I can't remember the gentleman's name, but even before the laureateship, I was always so fascinated by. There's this poetry festival in Miami called either O Miami or O Poetry. I can't remember which, but I would go to their website and see the different. Just some of them just wild ideas about how to engage and introduce poetry to just people, regardless of whether or not those people knew that these were poems that they were being inundated with. And so that was definitely a continual kind of refilling of my bucket, going to see what the folks at that poetry festival have continued to do. So that was a really big source of inspiration.
It seems like leading into my appointment, the Washington State Poet Laureates were everywhere. I got to do a workshop in the same sort of situation with Claudia Castro Luna, who was the Poet Laureate before me of Washington State. So she was there, and we got to chit chat and everything, and she gave me a poem from my pocket, and we talked, and she invited me to send her some stuff. And then Kathleen Flanagan, who was Poet Laureate of Washington 3 prior to me, curated a cohort that I was part of called the Jack Straw Writers, and she invited me to be a part of that cohort, and it was really cool. You know, and she interviewed me for like a radio show, and I remember walking down the hallway of the radio station, and all of Elizabeth Gilbert, also another poet laureate of Washington State, her prints that she made for the Seattle Children's Hospital were all there on the walls, kind of as like I was leading in, and Kathleen's telling me all about the work that Elizabeth Gilbert did, and then we had our chat, and then she said, you know, Rena, you really should try for this poet laureate position that's coming open again. And I was like, oh, I'm so busy, and secretly I was just terrified of the whole idea of it, and so I let it go by, and I was like, whew, dodged that bullet. And then COVID happened, and they're like, well, Claudia's going to sit on it for another year, and then we're going to open it again. And I was like, oh, I guess that means I got to apply. And so I did, and it was such a lovely process, the application process. So that was very reassuring, kind of, you know, like, oh, I could probably do this. That'd be okay. But also on a national level, well, Billy Collins, he was our national poet laureate, and he actually read my poem, The Index, that Hyde Erdrich selected for Poem a Day at Poets.org. And I remember watching him on the poetry broadcast going, oh my God, what is happening? He said I was clever. I was like, right? So there's that. But also, of course, obviously, Joy Harjo, she's such a treasure and just a superstar, so powerful. I got to be, the Indigenous Nations Poets inaugural fellowship was held at the Library of Congress, and during her closing ceremonies, and she said that as her final act as poet laureate, she wanted to have a dance party on the steps of the Library of Congress, and they honored that. And so we were out there having a dance party on the steps of the Library of Congress, and it was amazing and it was beautiful. But in her closing remarks, she talked about how the reason that she wanted to be a poet was because she needed for people to see Indigenous peoples as human beings, and I was just like crying, you know, as she's talking, because it was so resonant to me what she was saying. Yeah, so those are some poets laureate who have influenced me and been a part of my journey. Oh, and I forgot, I can't forget, Jim Bertolino, who was my mentor in undergrad, was actually chosen by the state legislature to outline what a Washington State Poet Laureate would do. And so he kind of traveled around in that role saying, it looks like this is what the Poet Laureate would do, and then made the recommendations. And then they started the program back up and used a lot of his recommendations. So what I ended up doing ended up being kind of like his handiwork anyway. So it was kind of cool it kind of came full circle.
Okay, so I have to ask you, when Billy Collins read your poem, did he do a good job or did he screw it up?
He did a good job, but he called me Rena, which is fine. I'm okay. It's fine.
Well, it's always strange to hear somebody else read your work and
weird.
the inflection and what they emphasize. Well, I think one of the great things about Fish Trap is it's an incubator for good ideas, and an idea that maybe we could hatch that, Mike, you instigated this panel, and so I like Kim's idea of a traveling band of poet laureates. So maybe regionally we could get these poet
Maybe
laureates
they should
together
be
and do
dispatched from Fish Trap.
yeah, dispatch from Fish Trap. Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go. That's why he's a poet, people.
Well, I want to say one thing. You know, you can be the poet laureate of your own people. It's a self-conferred opportunity. I met the poet laureate of Vashon Island, and I said, well, how did that happen? She said, well, I don't know. I was just at the farmer's market, and this pickup truck, the guy rolled down his window, and he said, you're our poet laureate. You know, but if you have an urge to speak for your place, to speak for your family, your tribe, your community, your occupational group, you can do a real service. You can answer that call.
I'm vying to be the poet laureate of Arrowhead up here on the hill, but I have pretty stiff competition in-house.
There's a poet laureate of the Washington State Ferries. Yeah.
I want that gig.
Yeah. They just ride the ferry and write poems. And
That sounds wonderful.
so cool.
Well, so what I'd like to do is leave a little time for questions, if that's okay, if anybody has a question, or I'd like to close by having each of you read another poem, if you would. But any questions? Mike, do we have time for one or two questions, or?
Let's do a couple. I don't have a mic, so you might have to stand up. You have a question?
I have a question. So, as poet laureate, you're often in diverse situations politically. How do you approach your universality of people and still have the courage to tell the truth?
I'll repeat the question back just a little bit for the online audience. The question is, so Poet Laureate, you are placed in a variety of political situations, and how do you address that and have the courage to speak honestly about that? Am I paraphrasing that somewhat accurately? Okay.
Well, I do a thing with an organization called SAGE, which is trying to get people to talk about difficult topics. And we start with the idea, Kate, that no matter how far we are apart on certain issues, most things we agree on. And poetry is often about things we agree on, you know, family, love of the young, love of the place we live. And I think with Rena saying, I can address climate change by talking about the beauty of nature, it doesn't seem disrespectful to the importance of divisive issues to find common ground where we can and push gently from there. And poetry is one way to do it because it's oblique. You know exactly what is it saying. And I find that people, you know, they listen to a poem and they often hear the part they are ready to hear. It's not strident, it's suggestive, it's elusive, it's an opportunity. So, I don't know.
Yeah, like I agree with a lot of what Kim was saying, just in that, you know, the aspect of how, I don't know, a poem very often is able to do the work that conversation or arguing can't, because it's sitting on what both those polarizing aspects are generally usually sitting on, you know? I think most things that are occurring between schisms of people and groups, you know, it ultimately boils down to one person or one side, their thoughts being centered in a place of fear, you know, and what is the spiraling outwards of how large that fear becomes and how, you know, unconnected to reality that fear potentially is. And, you know, the beauty of the poem is that, like, the poem sits on, you know, singular human truths. You know, so it's like if we can wire folks back to that, you know. With me personally, like, it's sometimes, you know, I don't know if it's just because of, like, me or because of, like, the shape of my city, state, and country, like, during my office, in that, like, I haven't been presented with lots of situations that perhaps could be spicy, just because I haven't been able to go and do many things outside of my city. And but, you know, it's I definitely am a person who is, I'm fairly vocal in person. Like about these things, and vocal on my social media, you know. I mean, like at some point in the pandemic, like my Twitter, which was largely for, you know, 10 years, 12 years, largely rooted in how can I just send off tiny poems into the world, and how can I talk about sandwiches and baked goods, basically turned into how much can I, like, berate my city council, you know? So that being said, I think it is like at times I know it's been a thought in my head of like, how do I balance this, you know, and am I supposed to balance it, you know? Aren't I allowed to sort of be the person that I am? Isn't that why I got appointed in this position? But I also haven't had a whole lot of opportunities to really sort of test that and see how that goes.
Well, I think that, you know, soft children who like poetry are often the ones that get bullied, right? And I think that it's because it's to make our sense of justice rock hard, and then also to make it so that we have a tough skin and then don't feel so bad about, like, you know, people being mean later on. But I'll respond to that question too, also through a poem. When I first was appointed, when I found out that I was going to get to be Poet Laureate, they said, okay, well, would you want to write a poem for Spark Magazine, which is Humanities Washington's official publication? I was like, oh, I'd love to. And they're like, okay, so we want you to write on the topic of discourse and dialogue in democracy. I was like, okay, no problem, right? Let me just get right on that. And then so I was like, oh, what am I going to say? And, you know, the whole thing about January 6th, I don't know if that happened yet or not. But anyways, there was enough, like, just, you know, division in our country. And so I came up with this because, you know, like, if you don't have trees, you don't really have democracy. So this is called The Forest for the Trees. I have seen a tree split in two from the weight of its opposing branches. It can survive, though its heart is exposed. I have seen a country do this too. I have heard an elder say that we must be like the willow, bend to not break. I have made peace this way. My neighbors clear-cut their trees, leaving mine defenseless. The arborist says they'll fall in the first strong wind. Together we stand. I see this now. I have seen a tree grown around, a bicycle, a street sign, and a chainsaw, absorbing them like ingredients in a great melting pot. When we speak, whether or not we agree, the trees will turn the breath of our words from carbon dioxide back into air. Give us new breath for new words, new chances to listen, new chances to be heard.
You know, I can imagine people on the other side nodding their heads, you know?
I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One more question, and then maybe a couple more poems. Does anybody have a question? Yeah,
Yes.
they're in the back, Deborah.
Well, I mean, I would throw out that, like, I think it's something that's always been around, or at least like, not necessarily always been around, but I know that from always through when I have engaged with spoken word, there's always been a pretty wide range of ways in which those poems are delivered, and there's always been in that time very stereotypical sounds of how a poem is to be read and delivered to people in person. You know, and so it's like that's something that I think is like has existed for, I don't know, a bit, but there was like, I wish I could remember, there was like an article some years ago now, I feel like maybe at 3 years, maybe like 6, 7 years ago, that was talking specifically about, and I forget what the term for this is. Maybe someone here knows. There's a specific term for like when the voice lilts upwards. And I can't remember what it's called, but it was a really interesting article because it was talking about how that there was a lot of, for whatever reason, a lot of highlighting of it at this juncture and a lot of backlash against it. And a lot of folks were also then talking about how what of this backlash was sexist or misogynistic, in that they found that many, many women spoke in this way, with this lilt going upwards. And, you know, what was it in our society that was asking or demanding or requiring folks that were not male to change the way that they might naturally speak? Or were there ways in which that, because of the patriarchal society that we live in, what were the ways that that society was shaping that lilt? And so, I don't know, it struck me as a really interesting point of conversation, and I think it's like been something that sits on different sides of derisiveness for a while. I don't know if that's like an answer to anything, but those are the thoughts that popped into my head.
I have a theory. So I used to transcribe a lot of oral history interviews. And when you're doing that, you have to pay such close attention, because you hear it over and over and over. You have to go back and, so you hear like what they're saying and how they're saying it. And what it sounds like to me when people are doing that is like a non-threatening way to ask for agreement. Do you know what I'm saying? And that's why women always do it, because we're always having to be so non-threatening to like people with fragile egos. And then they're like, oh yeah, okay. And then also, I heard this other thing about like vocal fry, which is the thing when people go down and like and they talk like that, like that, like, and then that is like the opposite, which is when a woman in particular, or a person, any person using vocal fry is trying to establish like an authoritative tone. They're talking like this because they want you to come over and see like this is what we're talking about, right? Like, you're with me, right? So and it's the same like our verbal tics when people are like, you know what I mean? Or even using the word like to say it's like this instead of just being declarative about how a thing is. It's needing to coax someone over into your way of thinking and by what you're saying and how you're saying it. And it's not even conscious. At least I don't think so, because when I'm transcribing, they just line up so perfectly. Like, no. That's my theory. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's all. I'm sticking to it.
Well, I guess the causes are mysterious, but it seems like the remedy is confidence, and that's why we teach writing. Be confident in your voice. Believe your opinions have a place in the world.
Will each of you take us out with a poem?
Yes.
We'll surf out on a high.
Yeah. I'll just say one other thing. The floor is low for the Poet Laureate. What you're supposed to do is, I think, promote literacy.
But the ceiling is infinite.
The ceiling is infinite, and I realized I don't want to make poems. I have much higher aspirations, and that is, I want to create something inside a listener's body. I want to create a transformation. And so I was going out to Two Rivers Prison, and I decided to write this poem for the inmates out there, and I read it to them. It's called Two Rivers. I think it's called Two Rivers because the Umatilla River and the Columbia have a confluence there. Two rivers for the inmates at Two Rivers Prison. One river flows above ground. Everyone can see it shining across the land, following the valley, shaping the valley, never at rest. And some people say, I know who you are. I know what you've done. what you've lost, where you came from, where you're going. I know. But what do they know of you, really? For another river flows below all that, invisible, at the speed of a dream, inside you, intuitive, curious, innocent. And you say, I know who I want to be. I know what I've learned. I know what I love. I need to know who I really am. So you remember, you wonder, you write, you shape story, and you say to yourself on the page, hidden river, spill your secrets at the wellspring. I hold forth my cup, no one else can see.
This got birthed out of the early days of the pandemic when we couldn't consort in many ways, and so at least in my life in my neighborhood, it was basically just like everybody going for walks alone, sometimes with a safe distance from another person. But I found myself walking in my neighborhood, a neighborhood that has been home since 2007, and for the first time walking down streets that I had never walked down before. And it's called Paseo, which is a Spanish term for evening walk. Dipping in sunset with a sip of the sky, mouth full of dusk and the becoming starlight. Any courage of yours the day has waned, may its jug be refilled by night drawing in. Who knew, with the sun still sinking like a soap bubble, that this is what it would look like when everyone here was hurting this much and at the same time? Like a cluster of stars we are, come together in our brightness. A northern mockingbird atop the phone pole, unspooling its song, harking the lark of night to fold beneath the eye of the moon, silver-rimmed lid winking itself to me. When in the gloaming, pinching a snapdragon into color, I watch a blooming, even when already bloomed, flowers loosening themselves like silk, falling from the neck into the dark that approaches, their perfume lifting from their shoulders. Into the air a smell somewhere between honeysuckle remembered and rose water stirred with sugar boiling on the stove. How can one not fall in love on a night like this? This world offering its blossoms, as if spring had been a thread that unraveled the trees in such manner that makes their bleeding not a letting of life, but rather a bursting of it. How can I not see how the earth is in love with me, in love with you, with any of us? Watch the flowers of the morn, how they open to the same sun that spends its whole day following you into this evening. My fingers twine with yours. Do not forget the wild scent of your sweet, soft, and learning and powerful heart. Do not forget the yellow of your heart's flowers, the purple of its dusk. Go walk at dusk when the sky has sunk to the color of a grapefruit undressed. May your heart hold space for a moment or two of peace, as mine does when looking up, as three crows above me pick up a fourth to weave their wings across the becoming moon, a calming, with the daylight clinging like leaves in September, and the night singing like ghosts of August, with the sky the color of a departure, and the land the color of a beginning. Sing soft or aloud the quiet songs of your youth, and thus perhaps gentle your heart, a lantern swinging on a windless night, your heart a conspirator with the dawn to make us better than we were the day before, your heart a flock of meadowlarks splitting the evening with song, your hearts flying like one body made from many small feathered ones.
So this poem I wrote, it was originally commissioned, it was called Heart Passage, and it was supposed to go with the trumpet piece. And then it just never quite worked out. And then someone got in touch and was like, will you write a baby board book that's kind of like a lullaby? And I was like, oh, geez, I don't know how to write for kids. And then I looked into what a lullaby is. And apparently lullabies are really dark. because, like, you know, Rockabye Baby, we don't know if that baby made it or not. But, like, apparently, like, it's just kind of a common theme. Lorca has a whole talk that he gave about how lullabies are just, like, the darkest type of poem for ever, you know, and anywhere. And I was like, oh, well, I could probably do that. Hey, look, we got a buddy here. And so I was thinking about it, and then at the same time, I was thinking about writing a piece for an organization that had a call out for, like, suicide prevention type themes. And I was thinking, well, if you write the baby board book for the parents, which is what was suggested for me, you know, you're writing for them anyway. So I gave it a shot, and none of that worked out, but this poem is the result. And it's called Dream Passage. On the path we walk toward purpose, if we feel we've lost our way, if our confidence deserts us, and we fear we've gone astray, when the road stretched out before us is a challenging terrain, this is when we search our hearts for a passage back to grace. Our dreams have wisdom to impart if we are true and brave, and though the night is dark, there is always a new day. When every door we try is locked, and the view out every window is of that lonely road we walked, full of worry, want, and woe. When the stream of life within is blocked by living in our sorrow, this is when we search our hearts for a passage to tomorrow. Our dreams have wisdom to impart if we are true to what we feel. Yes, indeed the night is dark, but our dreams have answers to reveal.
Thanks, Rena.
I totally arranged for him to, you know, nice little night walk through.
When you said we had a buddy, I thought was like, I hope it's a buddy. So I'd just really like to thank you, Kim, Anise, and Rena, for coming on the stage today, sharing your work, your thoughts on being the poet laureates. I'd like to thank all of you for turning out, and I have to go build a fire and make a lanyard. So we'll hope to see you later this evening. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, and I want to thank Robert for coming to us tonight.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So your next event is open mic at 4 o'clock.
Thank you, Anise.
Thank you, Kim, as always.
Yeah.
As always.